August 1765. A document is signed near a small town called Allahabad, and with a few lines of formal legal language, an actual company with shareholders and a stock price is handed the legal right to tax an entire province. No armies marched that day. No shots were fired. The document is called the Treaty of Allahabad, and the right it transferred is called the Diwani, the power to collect land revenue across Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, 3 provinces, tens of millions of people, some of the richest farmland on earth. The company was the East India Company. Up to this point, it had been in India to buy cotton and silk and sell them back home at a profit. After this point, it collected taxes from an entire population, with no vote, no accountability to the people who paid, and one obligation that never changed: revenue owed to London, on schedule, regardless of the harvest. 5 years later, that province was starving, and almost everything you have heard about that famine, every documentary, every textbook footnote, every viral post, repeats one number, a number this film is going to trace back to its source, because, as far as we can tell, nobody else has bothered to. That's not a preview. That's the investigation. To understand exactly what this document said and what it left unsaid, we need to look at the paper itself. This is not a reconstruction. It's the actual record, held today at the National Archives in the United Kingdom. A treaty dated the 16th of August, 1765, written out twice, once in English, once in Persian, because 2 administrations needed to read it and agree on exactly what it said. Some accounts date the underlying Diwani grant to the 12th of August, a separate but closely linked document. To stay precise, we'll simply say August 1765 throughout this film. Written into that record is a single clause that matters more than any other line in this story. The company acquires the right to collect land revenue, the Diwani, across Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. On paper, it looks like a partnership. The Nawab of Bengal keeps his title, his court, and formal control over criminal justice. What was called the Nizamat. The company takes the money. Historians call this arrangement the dual government, and for 7 years it functioned exactly as awkwardly as that division of labor suggests. One side held ceremonial authority, and the other held the treasury. Here's the part that doesn't fit neatly on a ceremonial seal. The Nawab's remaining authority was, in practice, nominal. The people collecting tax in the villages of Bengal answered ultimately to a corporation headquartered on Leadenhall Street in London, a corporation with shareholders expecting a return and, as we'll see shortly, an increasingly specific number it owed to the British government every single year. A tidy division of labor. On paper. In practice, one side of that partnership had a fixed appetite for revenue and no accountability for what happened when the harvest failed. 2 years before the famine peaked, the weather turned. The monsoon failed in 1768. It failed again, worse, in 1769. Fields that should have been green by September were reduced to dried straw. Smallpox moved through communities already weakened by hunger. Grain merchants, watching prices climb, held back what stock they had, speculation compounding a scarcity that nature had already caused. None of that, on its own, makes a famine into a systemic story. Droughts happen. Epidemics happen. What makes this one worth investigating is what the administration was doing at the exact moment the harvest was failing. In 1769, as the fields were drying out, the company sent a new kind of official into the districts of Bengal, supervisors. Their task was to assess what each district could produce and to draw up new rent rolls, tightened, updated records of exactly how much revenue each area owed. This was not a relief mission. It was an audit of paying capacity, dispatched at the precise moment paying capacity was collapsing. In villages across Bengal and Bihar, this played out as a slow unraveling rather than a single catastrophic event. Grain stores that would normally carry a household through one bad season had nothing left to draw on after two. There was no coordinated relief system waiting to absorb the shock. There was, however, a revenue system, and it was becoming more precise, not less, at exactly the wrong moment. Two systems moving in opposite directions on the same timeline. The land was failing. The paperwork was tightening. Neither one waited for the other. By the end of 1769, the price of rice had roughly doubled. It kept climbing into 1770. In a subsistence economy, that is not an inconvenience. It is the difference between a family eating and a family not eating. People sold tools, sold land, sold whatever little they had left just to buy grain at prices moving further out of reach with every week. Somewhere in that collapse, a market emerged that had nothing to do with feeding anyone. Grain that should have gone toward relief instead moved toward whoever could pay the most for it, and some of the people positioned to profit from that were the company's own employees. Historical accounts describe individual officials personally profiting from the grain trade during these exact months, on top of, not instead of, the revenue the corporation itself kept collecting. The precise scale of any one official's personal gains isn't something we can verify to the standard this channel holds itself to, so treat any specific figure you may have heard elsewhere with caution. That's the part that should sit uncomfortably. Profit and starvation, operating in the same districts, in the same months, sometimes through the same hands. And it's in exactly this window, the winter of 1769 into 1770, as prices climb and people are dying, that a specific claim about the scale of the disaster first enters the written record, a claim that gets repeated, decade after decade, publication after publication, until it stops sounding like a claim at all and starts sounding like a fact. Nobody in any account we could find seems to have gone back and asked where that number actually came from. So that's exactly what we're going to do next. This is the part of the film we've slowed down for. No music under this section. No dramatic language. What follows is an accounting exercise, and it deserves to be treated as one, not as a twist. The number you have probably heard, that roughly 1/3 of Bengal's population died, something close to 10 million people, does not come from a modern demographic study. Trace it back, and it leads to a single page. The Imperial Gazetteer of India, Volume 6, published in 1885, edited by W. W. Hunter. The sentence reads, 1/3 of the population of Bengal is credibly reported to have perished. Read that sentence again. Credibly reported. Reported by whom? The page doesn't say. There is no citation, no named source, no footnote pointing to a census or a count. A number stated as established fact, with its own origin left blank, and from this page it moved into 19th and 20th century writing, and from there into practically everything made about this famine since, including, almost certainly, some of what you watched before this video. So what does the actual historical record support? In 2000, the historian Rajat Dutta carried out a demographic revision of the famine and arrived at a far lower figure, roughly 1.2 million deaths, around 4 to 5% of the population, not 1/3. In 2018, the demographic historian Tim Dyson reviewed that work and called the traditional figure barely credible, persuasive enough to say the old number probably doesn't hold up, while stopping short of proposing a number of his own. Two estimates, both published by historians, roughly eightfold apart. We are not going to pick a side. Nobody watching this video should walk away thinking we settled a dispute that professional demographers haven't settled. What we can tell you is where each number came from, and that the gap between them is real. And here is the part we want to state as plainly as possible, because it matters more than the number itself. A lower estimate does not absolve the company. Whether the true toll was 1 million or 10 million, it does not change what the tax rolls show happened next. Getting the count right is an act of respect for the people who died. It is not an excuse for what comes next in this story. So take the number off the table. Set it aside entirely, not because it doesn't matter, but because this investigation doesn't need it to make its case. Here is what survives, regardless of which historian you believe: a documentary record of how a revenue-collecting corporation behaved toward a starving population during a subsistence crisis. Not what it said about itself afterward, what it wrote down in ledgers and orders while the famine was actually happening. If tracing a repeated number back to the single unsourced page it came from is the kind of history you want more of, that is what this channel does most weeks. Not the headline version of an event, but the paper trail underneath it. Subscribe if you want to see where the next one leads. For now, back to Bengal, because the ledgers are about to tell us something the death toll never could. Follow the money, not the body count. That's where this story goes next. Start 3 years before the famine. In 1767, Parliament in London had noticed that a trading company now controlled tax revenue from one of the richest agricultural regions on earth, and lawmakers wanted a share. Under that pressure, the company agreed to pay the British Treasury £400,000 a year and accepted limits on the dividends it could pay its shareholders in exchange for being left in its Bengal revenues essentially undisturbed. Sit with what that means. A fixed number, owed annually regardless of weather, harvest, or anything happening on the ground in Bengal. That obligation did not pause for famine. It did not know famine was coming. And when the famine arrived, in 1769 and 1770, the collection apparatus built to meet that number did not pause either. The company did not lower land tax assessments as the famine deepened. Then, in April of 1770, not before the famine, not after it, but near its very peak, the company announced a 10% increase in the following year's land tax. Not relief. An increase dated to the worst months of a subsistence crisis. Overall revenue collection through this period held close to its previous levels rather than falling in anything like proportion to what was happening to the population and the harvest. This is where the supervisors from Section 3 come back into the story. The apparatus tightening control over district-level collection since 1769 is the same apparatus that kept the numbers from moving downward when everything else was. None of these facts by itself proves intent the way a courtroom would require. But look at what they add up to. A corporation with a fixed annual payment owed to a foreign government. A collection system recently tightened for precision. A tax increase announced at the peak of a famine. Revenue that did not fall the way the underlying economy did. Put those 4 things next to each other, and you don't need the largest available death toll to reach a conclusion about what this institution prioritized when it had to choose. We want to be careful here, because this channel doesn't deal in quotes we can't verify. You may have heard that a company official once admitted revenue was, quote, violently kept up to its former standard. We looked for the original document behind that line and could not confirm it to a standard we're comfortable attaching to anyone's name. So we are not going to put those words in anyone's mouth. What we can tell you from records that do check out is what the tax rolls and the collection apparatus actually did, and what they did was hold the line. This is, in miniature, a pattern that tends to show up wherever an extraction target is fixed from far away and enforcement is delegated to people with no exposure to the cost of missing it. Bengal in 1770 didn't invent that dynamic, but it may be one of the starkest early demonstrations of it. A corporation, structurally obligated to hit a number, doing roughly what fixed obligations tend to produce when no one enforces a floor on human cost. The company held its revenue. It did not, however, hold together. By 1772, the mechanism that never missed a payment to London was itself in trouble. Mismanagement, a warehouse full of unsold tea, and mounting debt pushed the East India Company to the edge of collapse. 3 years after a famine, it had extracted revenue straight through. Parliament stepped in with a bailout, reported across sources as somewhere between roughly £1.2 and £1.5 million for the exact figure, and with it came the Regulating Act of 1773, capping the company's shareholder dividends at 6% until the loan was repaid. The crisis and the famine that helped produce it pushed the company away from the dual government arrangement we opened this film with. From 1772, under Warren Hastings, the company moved toward direct administration of Bengal's revenue collection. No more ceremonial nawab standing between the company and the province it taxed. The arrangement signed in a tent in 1765 was, within 7 years, replaced by something more honest about who was actually in charge. 2 separate ledgers close this story, and we're not going to let them blur into one. One ledger, Parliament's, was balanced in 1773. A loan, a repayment schedule, a dividend cap, eventually settled. The other ledger, the human one, was never fully counted at the time, and remains disputed by historians to this day. Getting the second number wrong doesn't make the first one matter more. It just means the accounting that mattered most is the one that was never properly done. That document we opened with, the treaty, the seal, the 2 languages, the single clause that handed a company the power to tax a province, is still sitting in an archive in London today. It didn't create a famine by itself, but it created the conditions under which a corporation's fixed obligations could outlast and outweigh the people paying for them.